Now we're streaming.
Live
Yeah.
live on YouTube. Wow.
Yes.
You have always been a rock star, Van.
Hey, how are you?
Fine, fine, thanks. And you?
Listo, ya estamos.
Okay. So, should we wait a couple of minutes? It's not 7 yet, right? Yes.
I'm easy. You tell me when to start talking.
Yeah, I will wait until 7 to present you.
Okay.
Whose dogs are barking in the background?
Yes, mine. I already made them stop.
Okay.
Okay, then I will have the honor to introduce Dr. Van Valim. And it is an honor to have him as our speaker today in one of our meetings of the Virtual Circle of Linguistics. Dr. Van Valim has been the leading developer of Role and Reference Grammar, or RRG, a grammatical model that was launched in the 80s at a time when the Chomsky approach was the dominant view with almost no competing theories. It took a lot of courage in those days to stand up and confront the linguistic tribe and say you saw things differently. And Dr. Van Valim had just what it took to do it. Many of us have benefited from the linguistic space he created. It offers us a way to think about grammar centered on the syntax-semantics interface and the syntax-pragmatics interface. Instead of thinking of language as an encapsulated knowledge about abstract computation, the underlying RRG assumption is that language is syntax, semantics, and pragmatics all at once. Or in other words, language is essentially about people communicating representations to one another. RRG is a very friendly and helpful environment for those of us who think that linguistic forms have meanings and that this is not just an accident, but one that should be the central research purpose. We need to make sense of forms. Without further ado, I would like to let Dr. Van Valim speak.
Okay, share. Let me share screen.
Are you able to share screen?
Let's see.
Martin?
Yeah, I think it's working. And the problem is I've got.
We have to make him co-host. Give me a minute. The thing is, Ana has to do it. Ana, ¿podríamos darle los permisos para de anfitriona al profesor para que comparta la pantalla?
Si me tenés que sacar a mí, sacame, Ana.
I'm the co-host now. Okay.
No. Listo.
Okay.
Now you should be able to share.
Okay. Ah, there we are. Is that coming through?
Yes, we can see your slide.
Ah, I'm screen sharing. Okay. So what I want to talk about today is the status of lexical categories in role and reference grammar. Most syntactic theories assume some variety of endocentric syntax where phrases are projections of lexical or functional grammatical categories. Moreover, the projecting categories are assumed to be universally valid. That is noun, verb, and adjective for lexical categories. That's Baker's 2003 argument. And aspect, negation, tense, illocutionary force are assumed to be universal as functional categories, among others. Role and reference grammar, on the other hand, rejects endocentrism as a fundamental feature of constituent structure. Rather, the two key notions are nucleus, which is a category neutral unit housing the predicating element in the clause, and which, viewed from a cross-linguistic perspective, is not restricted to any particular lexical category or even to being a head. It can be phrasal. And reference phrase, which is a potentially referring expression which may be headed in principle by a range of lexical categories. So where does the notion of nucleus come from? I want to introduce the RRG notion of the layered structure of the clause. RRG proposes that there are some universal features of clauses, and that these universal features are based on the following two distinctions, which are universal. Languages distinguish predicating elements from non-predicating elements. And among the non-predicating elements, they distinguish those that are semantically related to the predicate and those that are not semantically related to the predicate. In other words, all languages distinguish predicates from arguments and arguments from adjuncts. This yields the following structure. You have the predicate is one unit. The predicate plus its arguments is a second unit, and the non-arguments are in a third unit. And these are semantic distinctions, obviously, but they motivate the following syntactic units. So the notion of predicate motivates the syntactic unit nucleus. The predicate plus its arguments motivates what's called the core of the clause, and the non-arguments occur in the periphery, and the entire thing is a clause. Now, this is rather schematic. Expressed as a tree, you get the nucleus containing the predicate or the predicating element, which can be a head or a phrase. We'll see examples of that. And there are adjuncts that modify just the nucleus. They're adverbials pretty exclusively. The core of the clause consists of the nucleus and a number of arguments. There may be a nucleus that has no arguments, but there also have 1 or 2 or 3 arguments, which can be a reference phrase or an adpositional phrase. And there are core level modifiers, core level adjuncts that modify the core. And there are, then the clause dominates the core, and there are clause level adjuncts, and then the sentence is the highest node in the structure. A more concrete example from English, which includes some extra not universal elements. Tomorrow, what will Sally give to Max at the party? Give is the verb functioning as the predicate in the nucleus. There are 2 arguments inside the core. Sally, a reference phrase, and to Max, a prepositional phrase. The 3rd argument of give is displaced as a question word to what's called the pre-core slot, which not all languages have. There is a core level adjunct at the party indicating the location of where the giving event occurred. And there's a temporal adjunct, which is topicalized as a frame setting topic in what's called the left attached position. You'll notice that in the tree, you only have lexical items, lexical arguments, and lexical modifiers. The grammatical modifiers are in what's called the operator projection, which is below this, represented as being below the sentence, and will, which marks future tense, and in this case, interrogative illocutionary force, is connected to the operator projection, which is roughly a mirror image of the constituent projection. So let's return, after that brief introduction to the theory of clause structure in RRG, let's return to the question we were starting with, namely the appropriateness, the question of lexical categories. The appropriateness of nucleus and RP as opposed to VP and NP are illustrated in the following examples from Tagalog, an Austronesian language spoken in the Philippines, Nudka, a Wakashan language spoken on Vancouver Island on the west coast of Canada, and Lakota, a Siouan language spoken in the northern Great Plains of North America. So the first example is from Tagalog, nagtrabaho ang babae, the woman worked. The verb in the predicate slot is nagtrabaho, which you obviously recognize as a Spanish loan in Tagalog. Ang babae is a reference phrase functioning as the subject. Ang is the nominative case marker. So we have a garden variety sentence with a nominal subject and a verbal predicate. You can also say babae ang nagtrabaho, meaning the one who worked is or was a woman. where the predicate in the nucleus is babae, woman, and the argument is nagtrabajo, worked, together with ang, yielding translated into English, the one who worked is or was a woman. Second example is from Nudka. And Nudka, like Tagalog, is nucleus initial. And here again, you've got a garden variety sentence. The man is going. The predicate, the verbal predicate in the nucleus is go with the third person singular present tense agreement suffix. The subject is man, which takes the definite article. And as in Tagalog, you can basically swap the roots and have man in the nucleus as the predicate, taking the third person singular present tense suffix, and the verb go can take the definite article and occur as the argument, and you get the one who is going is a man. The third example is from Lakota. Again, in Lakota is the nucleus final. You have simple sentence, these women will not dance. You have woman followed by the definite article, followed by a plural determiner, demonstrative, hena. The verb is wachi, to dance. It takes be, which is agreement with the plural subject. Te is future. Shni is negation. And the sentence is those women will not dance. As in the other example, you can swap the noun and the verb, and you get those dancers will not be women. So the verb is the head of the reference phrase, co-occurring with the article in the plural demonstrative. And the nucleus is the noun woman in this case, which takes the same plural subject agreement, future tense, and negative marker as the verb to dance. In the A examples, the predicate is in the nucleus is a verb, and the head of the RP is a noun. In the B examples, on the other hand, the predicate in the nucleus is a noun, and the head of the RP is a verb, without derivational morphology or any special morphosyntactic treatment, unlike the corresponding elements in the English translation. Thus, RP and nucleus are not projections of a particular lexical category, but rather are category neutral. So this is the tree structure for the second example from Nudka, where the predicate in the nucleus is a noun, namely man. And then the ma suffix is connected to the operator projection. And the RP, the man, has the going one has the verb go as the head, and it takes the definite article, which is connected to the operator projection of the RP. So we have the same basic core structure in these intransitive predications, nucleus and RP, but in one case, the predicate in the nucleus is a verb and the head of the RP is a noun, and in the other case, it's reversed. The other crucial property of the nucleus, that its head can be phrasal, is essential for the analysis of Wari intentional state constructions from Everett 2008, exemplified in 4B. Wari is a Chapacuran language spoken in the Amazon region of Bolivia and Brazil. So in the first example, you have the men gave the children fish. You have the verb give, followed by a clitic cluster, which cross-references the direct core arguments and also expresses tense and aspect. That's the RP/P. Then you have a preposition, a noun fish, and then the two direct arguments, children, the recipient, and the subject man, men. A better translation of this that sort of reflects its grammar better would be the men presented the children with fish. This is a primary object language, so with the ditransitive verb like this, the recipient is the undergoer or object, not the theme. So this is an example of an intentional state construction. It begins with an embedded clause, who went to Guajara, which has the who is the first element, followed by a reduced auxiliary clitic, followed by the main verb, followed by the clitic cluster, which cross-references the subject, who, and the goal of the motion is treated like an object and is cross-referenced on the verb. This embedded clause is followed by the clitic cluster, main clause clitic cluster, which cross-references the chief and the women. And the sentence means, who went to Guajara, said the chief to the women, or who went to Guajara, the chief asked the women. You'll notice that the second, either on monosyllabic words and on in 4A, the second syllable of multisyllabic words is italicized. That's where the stress falls. And the main stress of the sentence is the stress on the verb at the beginning. In B, you'll notice that in the embedded clause, only the final syllable of the entire embedded clause is stressed. Other words are not stressed. And then the clitic cluster and the core arguments of the main clause, the last syllable is stressed. So Wari word order is a WH expression, optional if it's a WH question, but nucleus initial, followed by the clitic cluster, and then the core arguments. And the question is, what is in the nucleus in the main clause in 4B? The only possibility is the embedded clause, who went to Guajara, as Everett argues convincingly. There's no lexical verb in the main clause. Notice that that embedded clause, as I mentioned, who went to Guajara, is stressed only on the last syllable of the last word, which goes along with the way a multisyllabic verb would be stressed in a simple sentence. There are a number of other interesting complications, which obviously I don't have time to go into, but you can look at Everett's account. The structure of the sentence looks something like this, where the predicate in the nucleus is, in fact, the embedded clause, which is the content of the can't say verb of saying, the proposition as interpreted as being a verb of saying, but there is no lexical verb of saying. There's only the content of the speech, and that functions as the nucleus, which is immediately followed by the clitic cluster and then the core arguments. It's a rather unusual structure, and but it's not unique to Wari. It's found in a few other unrelated languages in Brazil. Intentional state constructions are exocentric constructions, that is, they're headless in phrase structure terms. And as such, they are problems for approaches that require all phrases to be endocentric, that is, headed. They are no problem for the notion of nucleus, which is not restricted to lexical heads of certain categories. Embedding a clause in a nucleus is highly marked in terms of the strong tendency towards symmetrical embedding, that is, embedding units of the same size into each other, but it's not excluded by the theory. Everett 2008 shows that reformulating the description of Wari clause structure in terms of nucleus in place of V or VP leads to a comprehensive account of all of the ISC's properties. Thus, the notions of RP and nucleus are lexical category neutral syntactic categories, which make the analysis of 1B through 3B straightforward, and the fact that they are not projected from a lexical head but can accommodate phrases leads to an explanatory account of Wari intentional state constructions. Do all languages distinguish nouns from verbs? This is a question that's been asked many times. One of the ways that the data in 1 through 3 have been interpreted is as evidence that these languages do not distinguish nouns from verbs. Facts like these have led some linguists to argue that Tagalog roots have no inherent lexical category and get assigned one on the basis of how they were used in an utterance. And generalizing this is a Borer's approach and distributed morphology. This is questionable, however, because it confuses lexical category with grammatical function. Nagtrabajo, worked, is a predicate in 1A and an argument in 1B, while babae, woman, is an argument in 1A and a predicate in 1B, but the category of each word does not change. The point is not that Tagalog lacks lexical categories, but rather that there are few restrictions on what can function as the predicate in the nucleus or the head of an RP. The same would hold true for Nudka and Lakota. In fact, detailed investigation of these languages has revealed that there are morphophonological and or morphosyntactic asymmetries which justify positing at least two distinct lexical classes. Himmelmann 2008 distinguishes nouns from verbs in Tagalog based on a morphological criterion. Verbs can take voice morphology, while nouns cannot. Jacobson, 1979, shows that in Nudkan languages, there are subtle asymmetries between two classes of words in terms of ease of serving as the predicate in the nucleus. The favored class contains words denoting actions, events, and states of affairs, while the other class contains words referring to objects, people, animals, etc. Boaz and Deloria, 1942, note that there are morphophonological differences between nouns and verbs in Lakota. For example, vowel contraction. Nouns tend to contract adjacent vowels, while verbs do not. And reduplication, common with verbs, very rare with nouns. A further difference can be observed in 3, repeated below. In Lakota, it is not possible to mark number on a noun functioning in an RP as an argument or adjunct. Plurality can be marked by a quantifier or plural determiner, or it can be signaled by plural cross-reference on the verb. Both of these are illustrated in 3a. So there's no quantifier in 3a, but hena, those, is a plural demonstrative, and the p suffix on the verb to dance indicates that it has a plural subject. But you cannot mark number on wia or any other noun in Lakota. There is no marking of plural on nouns themselves. When the head of the RP is a verb and is plural, however, it must take plural marking in addition to any quantifiers or plural determiners and plural cross-reference on the predicate, as in 3b. So in 3b, we have those dancers will not be women. Dancer is derived from dance, which takes the b plural suffix, which it took as in 3a in agreement with the plural subject, despite the fact that you have the plural demonstrative, hena, and plural cross-reference on the verb. The p is obligatory when the head of the RP is a verb, and impossible when it's a noun. So you can't say wiam pi ki hena wachipi kteshni. So this is a morphosyntactic difference between nouns and verbs. Given the discussion of the previous section, the answer would seem to be yes, nouns and verbs are universal. This conclusion is supported by the nature of language as a communication system. One of the major functions of language is communication with other humans, and what is communicated in many instances is information, which can be represented as propositions. Propositions involve reference and predication, and therefore languages have elements which are specialized for reference and other elements specialized for predication. The former are nouns and the latter are verbs. Hence, the universality of nouns and verbs follows from the very nature of language as a system of communication, just like the universal parts of the layered structure of the clause. However, languages differ as to the semantic domains encompassed by the nouns and verbs in them. While words referring to objects, entities, people, animals, etc., will typically be realized as nouns, and those referring to actions, events, states of affairs, etc., will typically be instantiated as verbs, others may be realized in different ways in different languages. Consider property expressions: tall, little, red, black, rich, happy, etc. In some languages, English, Spanish, German, they constitute a word class all their own, namely adjectives. In other languages, however, they do not constitute an independent word class, but rather are treated as a subtype of noun or verb. In Yerbal, an Australian Aboriginal language, property words are assimilated to the category of noun and are treated morphosyntactically like nouns. In Lakota, on the other hand, they are construed as a subclass of verbs and take the same inflectional morphology as verbs. So if we take our example about the women and replace dance with be tall, we get those women will not be tall, and the property expression tall, huska, slots right in to the predicate slot, taking the same inflectional suffixes as the other elements. Thus, even though all languages have nouns and verbs in their lexical inventory, the substantive content of these categories may vary from language to language. Another kind of cross-linguistic variation is how deep, so to speak, the distinction between the two lexical classes is. In the languages we have looked at so far, Tagalog, Nudka, and Lakota, the contrast is not very deep at all, with nouns and verbs sharing a lot of grammatical properties. This contrasts sharply with languages like Latin, Russian, and Yerbal, which make strict divisions between the two main categories, with English somewhere in the middle. All of this variation suggests that a firmer foundation is needed for a theory of lexical categories in RRG. So at the most basic level, lexical items fall into one of two classes. They're either referring expressions or predicates. This is related to the fundamental opposition motivating the layered structure of the clause, namely the opposition between predicating and non-predicating elements, which, as mentioned earlier, follows from the nature of language as a system of human communication. Referring expressions and predicates can have one of three grammatical functions: argument, predicator, or modifier. In 1 through 3, a predicate is functioning as the predicator in the nucleus and a referring expression as the core argument in the A examples, whereas in the B examples, a referring expression is the predicator in the nucleus, and a predicate serves as the head of the core argument. The traditional categories of verb, adjective, adverb, and adposition are semantically predicates and grammatically predicators or modifiers as defaults. In RRG semantic representations, which I haven't introduced, it has always been the case that lexical modifiers and meaning-bearing adpositions are represented as predicates. Referring expressions would form the core of the language-specific category of noun, and predicates expressing actions and events would form the core for the category of verb in a language. Languages vary as to how they treat predicates expressing states, predicates expressing properties of attributes, predicates expressing manner, predicates expressing location, etc. In Universal, predicates expressing states and manner are assimilated to the verb category, while those expressing properties and attributes are part of the noun category. In Lakota, on the other hand, all of these types of predicates fall into the verb category. Defining lexical categories in terms of their morphophonological and morphosyntactic properties leads to the observation that Tagalog, Nudka, Lakota, and other such languages show that languages need not make deep lexical category distinctions, and this seems to follow from the ability of lexical items to function as an argument, predicator, or modifier rather freely. This ability is an important morphosyntactic property which many or all lexical items share, and it is precisely the morphosyntactic properties that different words do not share that is the basis for assigning them to different lexical categories. So weakly developed lexical categories and shallow and the ability of lexical items to, say, function freely as in one of these ways goes hand in hand. In languages with well-defined lexical categories or deep lexical categories, there are strict constraints on the grammatical function that a given lexical category may have. For example, nouns, referring expressions, can be arguments, verbs, predicates of certain semantic types, can be predicators, and adjectives and adverbs, predicates of certain semantic types, can be modifiers. These restrictions are among the morphosyntactic properties which define the category. If a category is to have a different grammatical function, for example, noun or adjective as predicator or verb as argument, special morphosyntactic treatment is necessary. For example, the use of an auxiliary verb or verbalizing derivational morphology for nonverbal predicators, or nominalizing derivational morphology for non-nominal arguments. These special treatments are also part of the properties defining the different categories. This pattern is found in many European languages, and it has been taken as the norm for human language. This view has led some linguists, when confronted with Tagalog, Nudka, Lakota type languages with shallow category distinctions, to posit derivational morphology for verbalization and nominalization, all of which is marked by zero morphemes. Thus, on this type of analysis, Babae in 1B has undergone zero marked verbalization, yielding to be a woman, and nagtrabaho worked has undergone zero marked nominalization, yielding the one who worked. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I should mention that, and this is one of the more embarrassing moments of my professional career. I was lecturing at a university in Manila in the Philippines about RRG back in 2004. And one of the audience was all native speaker of linguists of different Philippine languages. And this one fellow raised his hand and said, "What's all those N's and V's in your tree? They don't mean anything to us. How would you analyze a sentence like, say, 1B?" And I started to answer, and as soon as I gave my answer, I regretted it immensely because I said, well, I guess there's zero mark nominalization of nagtrabaho, and I immediately realized that is a terrible analysis. And that's what got me thinking seriously about this problem. I also cite as an example of what I'm talking about, another example of what I'm talking about here, a paper on a language in which it was claimed the language has no inflectional morphology, but rich derivational morphology, all of which is zero marked. It seems to me if you have to claim that all the morphology is zero marked, maybe that's not the right way to look at it. The RRG analysis of 1B to 3B given above does not involve any zero mark derivational morphology. Rather, the category neutral of RP and nucleus makes possible a straightforward description of these phenomena. For languages with deep category distinctions, they are readily formulable in terms of RP and nucleus. For example, in English, a nonverbal predicator requires an auxiliary verb, normally be, in order to have a well-formed nucleus. That's something, for example, that you don't have in those Lakota examples. The dancers will be women. Women is simply directly the functions as the predicator, or in the case of those women will not be tall. Tall directly functions as a predicator, no special marking required. Note that in terms of this scheme, the pred node under the nucleus node in the layered structure of the clause should be interpreted as predicator rather than as predicate. Adpositional predicates can be arguments, as with verbs like put, or adjunct modifiers, as in the example earlier, what did tomorrow, what will Sally give to Max in the library? They can also function as predicators in locational predications like John is in the house. What then is the status of lexical categories in RRG? The universal semantic distinction is between referring expressions and predicates, which underlies the noun-verb dichotomy. It is analogous to the actor versus undergoer distinction, which is semantic and universal, and which underlies the traditional subject-object dichotomy. The lexical categories beyond noun and verb in a language are differentiations of the functions of predicates as modifiers, i.e. as adjectives or adverbs. And all these distinctions must be justified morphophonologically and or morphosyntactically. Thus, from an RRG perspective, lexical categories are like grammatical relations, language specific, but with a universal semantic foundation. Thank you.
Thank you, Van. Very interesting talk. So, thank you very much.
Should I stop screen sharing or what?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we can start the questions if you don't mind. Do you allow us to start questioning?
Sure.
Okay. So, Martin, can you know how to lead this?
Yeah.
So we will write the questions on the chat, and then Martin will read them, and then if we need, we can talk, right? So the person who asked the question can also talk.
Yeah, the chat should be now open. So, sorry. Give me a second.
Okay.
So, please let me know if you see this message. I'm opening the chat.
Yeah, the chat is now open.
Good, very good. So if you can please write down your questions there or comments. If you want, you can also turn on your mics and ask the questions yourselves. But if not, I can read them out.
Okay, I'm trying to figure out how to get you guys back.
No, Martin will read the question if the person doesn't want to speak. Martin will read the question, and or the person herself or himself will say it out loud.
Okay, I'll send a PDF of the slides to you, Luis, after we're done, in case anybody
Great.
wants a copy of the slides.
So while people are thinking about the questions, I might ask you one, if I may, so that we are not silent. My question would be, I mean, I really appreciate the talk, because I have always been not very happy with the idea of Marantz and distributed morphology, and about a root that has no category assigned, that is some sort of entity that is, I don't know what it is. So that was a problem for me. So the idea that there are always categories assigned is, it makes me more comfortable. Now, my point would be about the nucleus. So the idea of a nucleus still points to the presence of an asymmetry between constituents, right? Between the words that are combined. One is the nucleus, the other one is the non-nucleus.
Right.
And the question would be, what makes, in those languages, especially with shallow categories, what makes the word to be the nucleus? So what is the information that is crucial to decide that this word is the nucleus in this particular sentence?
Okay, let me If you take the Nudka example, it's rather nice. You could think of the core in Nudka as consisting of a nucleus which contains a predicator and an obligatory inflectional element, which expresses tense and number and person of the subject. And the argument essentially being some root that's attached with the definite article. So you have sort of a frame where the grammatical elements that are relevant to the predication, like tense and aspect, are located in connection with a lexical item. And the non-nuclear part is also, like the RP subject, is a lexical item with a definite article or other such argument marking morpheme on it, so that the nucleus is indicated by semantically the predicate and morphosyntactically by the relevant inflectional categories. If you have no inflectional categories, you, like in, say, Mandarin or an East Asian language with little or no inflectional morphology, it gets interesting. But given that the predicator in the nucleus defines the range of elements that can co-occur with it, it's readily identifiable as the nucleus.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it is very hard to imagine, to picture really a language like, with an expression like to be, but I totally understand the idea, even though I have a hard time imagining how to predicate a noun to a verb, so to speak, but I understand the idea, so thank you, Van.
Well, I
Sonia,
mean, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Sonia Suarez Cepeda has a question. She's asking if word order is not relevant in Nudka. She says the order the speaker chooses isn't that pragmatically relevant.
You mean the order of the phrases in, like, the order of the phrases or the order of the roots?
Sonia, could you clarify?
I'm thinking of the order of the nucleus. I mean, placing the nucleus, either a verb or a noun with those inflectional marking. Does it mean that the speaker wants to focus? I don't know. It's just a question. Is it why is the speaker making those choices and placing those things in first position as a nucleus? What
Well,
order?
that's the default order. You can have elements before the nucleus. I mean, Nudka has you confront arguments and adjuncts to occur before the nucleus.
Mhm.
And a number of the inflectional elements that we associate with verbal expressions are actually clitics in Nudka. So they they occur second in the clause. So if you had like I can't remember exactly what the range of clitics is. It's been a while since I looked at it. But if you put a noun phrase in front of the verb, like topicalize the object or have an adjunct, those clitics will attach to the first element in the clause,
Okay.
which confused early linguists tremendously because they would find a tense clitic stuck on a noun.
Mhm.
They didn't recognize that they didn't have the distinction between affixes and clitics. So it looked like you had a bare verb stem and all of the inflections that you would expect on the verb would be on the noun occurring before the verb.
Okay. Mhm. Thank you.
And
Carlos
so,
González
I mean, Nudka does have some flexibility of word order.
Mhm.
I
Okay,
should
thank
also
you.
mention, if you're familiar with Benjamin Lee Whorf's writings on American Indian languages, he gives Nudka examples in one of his papers, and he glosses the suffix ma as manifestation, which sounds wonderfully exotic. And I was really disappointed when I discovered it really just means third person singular present tense.
Thank you. Thank you. It's clear.
Carlos González Vergara has a question. He says, from a lexical perspective, is a word like fish in English a noun or a verb? Since you don't have derivational morphology acting, what features can orient this classification?
Sorry, what was the word?
Fish.
Fish. English has a I would say that I mean, I'm thinking historically here, but I would think fish was primarily a noun which gets used as a verb. I mean, English is flexible in that way with many kinds of elements. So you have lots of cases of what people in traditional morphological terms describe as zero derivation or conversion, I think. And it can be, I mean, different varieties of English are more or less liberal in this regard. I've always thought American English was pretty liberal in this regard. And then I lived in Australia and saw things like signs in a restaurant saying, please maple syrup your pancakes, with a dispenser on the table, using maple syrup as a verb, or as the predicate in terms of what I've said in here, using it as the predicator, which certainly is not something I would do in my dialect. And so I think in most of these cases, like saddle a horse and shelve a book, it's been argued that those involve incorporation, and from a generative point of view, they involve incorporation of the noun into the VP with a null verbalizing element. And I would just say that English is looking a lot like Tagalog and Nudka in these cases, but it doesn't always allow that. Whereas I don't know of any restrictions on Tagalog or Lakota, the two of the I know those two languages better than Nudka. I don't know of any restrictions on using a nominal as a predicator in those languages.
Gisela Mueller says, thank you for your interesting talk. Could you give us a precise definition of periphery? Is it only equated with left detached position?
Sorry, say that again.
Could you give us a precise definition of periphery? Is it only equated with left detached position?
No. The default case of a periphery is basically not, with one exception, not an argument. It's an adjunct modifier. So adverbs modifying the nucleus or the core or the clause are peripheral. Adpositional phrases expressing location, time, reason are peripheral. And they can occur, their default position varies depending upon the word order type of the language. So in English, you have the default position of peripheral adjuncts is after the core. In verb final languages like Japanese, the default position for at least phrasal adjuncts is after the subject and before the object in the verb. In many languages, it's possible to displace these to the initial position and have them set up as a frame setting topic, like in the example of yesterday or at the library, Bill met a woman, blah, 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 where the library or the time is taken as setting the scene in a certain way. But that's not the default position. The default position is, like I said, depends upon the word order type. Verb final languages tend to have the phrasal adjuncts between the subject and the object. Verb medial languages tend strongly to have the adjuncts following the core. as the default position. So does that answer your question?
Okay, thank you very much. And what about the modal adverbs or phrases like I think that or I believe that, modal verbs, for example? Do you consider that? Yes, that these are
okay.
okay.
Well, there's three things there that fall in the category of modal type elements. One would be modal adverbs. He probably did this, or he possibly did that. Adverbs are subject to complex ordering constraints, especially when you have two of them. And each adverb is in its own periphery. So there's a distinction between phrasal adjuncts and non-phrasal adjuncts, and the constraints on them are different. Modal auxiliary verbs are connected to the operator projection, not the constituent projection. And one of the claims that RRG has made right from the get-go, starting in the 80s, was that the order of the morphemes expressing the various operator categories, which include tense aspect, epistemic modality, deontic modality, illocutionary force, negation, that the order of the morphemes expressing these operators reflects the clause layering. So when you have all of the inflectional morphemes on one side of the nucleus or the other, the morphemes that express or modify the nucleus occur closer to the nucleus than those modifying the core, which occur closer than those modifying the clause. And if you look at agglutinating verb final languages, for example, you find that that's exactly the pattern you find illustrated most clearly, where the aspect which modifies the nucleus occurs closer to the verb stem or the predicator than tense, which modifies the clause as a whole, and illocutionary force, which is the outermost operator, since it defines the speech act, is almost always the last element in the string. So you have operators expressing modal elements, and then the examples you gave, like I think he's going to come, I believe he's going to come, I'm sure he's going to come, it's likely that he's going to come. Those would be treated as complex sentences with the modal predicate as the nucleus of the main clause.
Okay, thank you very much.
Cynthia Alicia says, if I understand right, inherent lexical categories are to be kept discriminated from grammatical functions, whether they function as arguments or predicates in the clause. Also, morphological properties are not a good way of discriminating them. And she apologizes. She says, perhaps I got lost here. So how can we discriminate if a word is a noun or a verb in the lexicon if we only have the information provided by the clause and morphology is not an indicator? She says that she works in psycholinguistics and having a clear way of distinguishing lexical categories is sometimes crucial.
Yes, well, it's difficult in languages without a lot of morphology. It can be extremely difficult. People have argued that, I mean, in languages like Tagalog, you have voice morphology that is restricted to a subclass of elements. If the language had simply no morphology at all, I think it would be difficult. I guess the only criteria you could possibly come up with would be syntactic criteria or perhaps morphophonological, but then that ties you back to morphology again. People have had trouble. I mean, people who worked on East Asian languages have had difficulties justifying category distinctions because there was little, I mean, some people have just proposed that there are distinction between particles versus substantive elements, and then the substantive elements are the ones with lexical meaning, and they can function as a predicate or an argument, and there's no other criteria, no other reason for separating them into classes.
Okay, but can I add something?
Sure.
So actually my question, because I don't know if I understood. Okay, my question is, role and reference grammar would be okay with using morphology as a criterion to distinguish between nouns and verbs, and in that case role and reference grammar still keeps the difference between morphology and syntax. That in the case of distributed morphology, well, they try to avoid that difference. That is why they don't use perhaps morphology as a criterion. So can we use morphology following role and reference grammar?
Yes. That was the morphology may be in some cases like in the suggestion of Himmelmann's for Tagalog, that the only evidence you have for distinguishing nouns and verbs is morphological.
Okay, so according to role and reference grammar, morphology is still closer to the lexicon, right? Yeah. So it's an indication.
Yeah.
Of, okay.
Yeah, it's definitely not distributed morphology.
No. Okay. Thank you, that was really clear.
Well, I have a question myself. It's a bit of a technical question, but I don't understand the motivation of positing a pred node right below the nucleus. Could you clarify that for me?
Yes. It looks redundant.
Mm-hmm.
And in lots of cases, it is redundant. But it turns out that there are cases of nuclei which function as modifiers rather than predicates.
Mm.
So the thing I'm thinking about is languages, serializing languages, which use verbs as aspect markers. So in Lakota, for example, you have, as background, you have two verbs to stand. One which takes an animate subject and one which takes an inanimate subject.
Mm-hmm.
Now, cross-linguistically, to express what's roughly like the progressive or the continuative, you tend to, many languages use a stance verb, sit, stand, or lie, serialized with another verb to indicate continuing action. In Lakota, you use the verb to stand that goes with inanimate subjects.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to say I'm singing, well, the verb to stand for inanimates is hung. And so if you want to say I'm singing, you say wa lawan hung. Wa is I, lawan is to sing, and hung is the progressive continuative. So I'm singing. Now, when hung occurs as a predicate on its own, as a predicator,
Mm-hmm.
it has to have an inanimate subject. But in combination with sing, it's co-occurring with an animate subject. So it's not a co-predicate, it's just a modifier, but it's not an inflectional morpheme, it's still the verb to stand. Speakers recognize it as being the verb to stand. So it's a syntactic construction in which you have two nuclei, one sing, which takes an argument, and the other one stand, which does not predicate, but rather modifies. And so its selectional restrictions are not relevant to the construction as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
So there you have a nucleus which is not a predicator. And so that's one of the reasons why I think the notion of pred is important, even though in most cases, nucleus and pred are redundant. But there are cases where you have non-predicating nuclei. In fact, you can combine sing with animate stand and inanimate stand and get he was standing singing,
Mm-hmm.
where you have three nuclei in a row, sing, stand, stand,
Mm-hmm.
and the first stand is the one that takes an animate argument and co-predicates with sing, and the second stand is the one that modifies and doesn't co-predicate.
Okay. Okay. And is it possible to have a nucleus that does not predicate? Or not? I'm
What do you
thinking
mean?
maybe of an embedded sentence. Maybe with a missing predicator and only a non-predicating nucleus to provide a spectral information, for example.
Ah, let me think. Well, yeah, you have situations like that in things like VP ellipsis. So
Exactly.
Mary is eating an ice cream cone and Bill is too, where all you have no nucleus in the, nothing in the nucleus, but you have a nuclear operator aspect. Yeah, I've got an analysis of that in my 2005 book in chapter 7. There's an analysis of exactly that construction.
Okay, thank you. I will look into that. Thank you.
Okay.
Van and Martin, there are no other questions, right?
Yeah, and there are no more questions. There are no questions at all on YouTube. So,
Okay. Okay. May I ask you, Van, just a doubt? Going back to Carlos' question, what would you say to somebody who says, look, fish, in order to get the verb fish, you need the thing fish. But in order to get the thing fish, you don't need fishing. You don't need the action, the event of fishing, right? So,
right.
So there is a semantic argument that would suggest you to derive the verb from the noun, not the other way around.
Yes,
Does it make sense?
I agree that the noun is more basic.
Okay. So it's a sort of reasoning that makes sense.
Yes.
Okay.
I would agree with that. Because you've got a lot of verbs which mean to do something with a particular noun, right?
Right. Like this, like fishing.
Fish, saddle, like saddle a horse.
Yeah. Box. Box
up the present, whatever. It would be weird to think that those are originally verbs and that the nouns are somehow derived from them, especially with something like the example I gave from Australia, using maple syrup as a predicate. It's pretty clear that maple syrup is fundamentally an entity, a noun.
Right.
It gets even weirder in Australian English because you take the verb try in the sense of try something out, and you derive a noun trial, like you get a free trial offer, and then they take the derived noun trial and use it as a verb. So they talk about, I saw a headline when I lived in Australia saying the newest Australian Navy ship is trialing off the New South Wales coast. And I thought, what on earth does trialing mean? And it's verbalizing the nominalized form of try.
Mhm.
I mean, that just blew my mind.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It's certainly not part of my dialect of English.
If I may, in Spanish, you also hear stuff like that. Nominalizations which are verbalized, but with a very specific meaning. So, for instance, you hear people say things such as recepcionar, derived from recepción, which in turn is derived from receive. But recepcionar is, in most of the cases, only used in a narrower sense. For instance, when you receive mail, so recepcionamos el paquete o recepcionamos el documento. Literally, we receptionized the documents or the package. So it's very similar to that. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So
It's not just an Australian sin.
yeah.
It's widespread.
Or for instance, accesar, yeah, which is access, but I think it's used only in the sense of logging into a program, for instance, or logging into an account on the internet.
Mhm.
If you would allow me to intervene, that is very common in Spanish, and morphologically, I call it forward formation. We have a lot of nouns that are complex nouns derived from verbs, and then what you do to the complex noun is you add a verbal ending. So that's very common. Think also of ambición, ambicionar. So that's all over the place in Spanish. Not just that one verb that you mentioned, Martin, but it's all over the place.
Why do you call it, Pascual? Why do you call it complex noun?
I mean, no, complex in the sense of morphologically complex. So it's already complex, but then the derivation goes on forward. So another good example is coleccionar, because colección is already complex morphologically. It comes from collect, that's the root or the base, whatever you want to call it. And then that's why a lot of people now are beginning to say colectar, which is what it should have been all the time to start with. So colectar, but we say coleccionar instead of colectar. Coleccionar estampillas instead of collect stamps, which you say in English. Recolectar, yes, but coleccionar, just, another good example is we have influir, from which we derive influencia, but then again, you go forward and you say influenciar, which is unnecessary. But, you forget that influencia is already morphologically complex. And so the derivation continues. I don't know if English has this.
Well, one thing you notice is people like to, I know it sounds weird to say, play with language and use things in new ways.
But of course, there is lexical specialization. Recibir is more general, and recepcionar, as Martin said, is more specific. So recepcionar means, you get a package or whatever that comes in the mail, and there is maybe a process in which you sign on saying, yeah, I have received this. But recibir, has a more general meaning.
Yeah, in fact, I was thinking that maybe a generalization is that all those subsequently derived verbs, for instance, could be predicted to always have a more specific sense. Yeah, it would be strange to have the the subsequently derived verb having the more general sense, and the morphologically simple or morphologically simpler verb having a more specific sense. Of course, there might be exceptions to that, but I guess it's a generalization that has an empirical basis.
It might be related to Grice's maxims of using a more complex expression implicates a particular meaning. So the more complex form implicates a more specific meaning. Otherwise, you would use the more general form with the more general meaning.
Yeah, and it's also related to the no synonymy principle, in the sense, why do you want to have two different forms that have exactly the same meaning, you know? So that happens all over the place. That is what Piparsky, you know, in the lexical phonology and morphology model used to say, right? It's the same in English, in fact. So you have ring, ring, rang, rung, but then to circle is a regular verb. So you say, for instance, the natives ringed, you know, form their ring around. In that case, it's regular. I think it goes back to the old, you know, model of lexical phonology and morphology. And then oceanography principle.
So is there any other question or comment?
I'll say hi, Lilian.
There is a comment by Mariela Hualpa. She says that from a historically point of view, verbs have been derived from nouns. I suppose she's talking about the case of fish. So nouns existed first.
Sorry. The noun existed first. Yeah, that's what I'm assuming. The noun use preceded the verbal use with all of those examples. Did I miss the question?
It was just a comment.
Oh, okay.
There was no question.
Okay. Maybe we should thanks Van again for this great opportunity. And there were many people here in Argentina and Chile that wanted to meet you, and this has a sort of way of meeting you. And
no, it's great. It and it avoids jet lag.
Yes. and getting sick with the water or the food, the local food.
Yeah. Oh, the food in Argentina is great.
Yeah. But I remember that you got too fond of the ice cream here in Mendoza.
Oh, I'm a big fan of ice cream. All over the world.
But okay. So thank you very much again. I don't know if somebody else want to say something, but we really
Thank you for
appreciate
the opportunity to talk and interact with your group.
Thank you, Van. It's thank you very much. And thank you everybody for being present too. Guillermo, Carlos, Fernando, Lilian, Santiago, Marisa. Hola, Marisa. These are the people
Thanks
that I
much
am.
for interesting talk.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, Van.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
So
you.
thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks, Van.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, there are several thank you messages on the chat. Yeah, from Claudia, Mariela, Laura Ferrari, Matias, Andreina, Santiago.
Thanks.